Caroline Williams was no stranger to wonders. She moved through the opulent corridors of life with the assurance of someone accustomed to extraordinary privilege, yet carrying a quiet dignity earned, not bestowed. But on this particular morning, as sunlight spilled onto the polished floors of Los Angeles International Airport, even Caroline could not anticipate the drama that would unfold at Gate 24, destined to shake the hearts and stir the minds of everyone who would witness it. The cabin of Flight 892, bound for Denver, hummed with an undercurrent of anticipation. Travelers adjusted suits, sorted tablets, and sipped lattes, all keenly aware of the importance of first class. Each passenger believed themselves entitled to comfort and respect, cocooned from the struggles further down the jetway. The entrance to this realm of privilege was a well-guarded boundary, separating those who belonged from those who simply aspired. Little did they know, a girl whose story defied every surface assumption was moments away from crossing that invisible threshold. Caroline embodied grace. At 11 years old and just 3'6", her presence was assured, her steps confident and steady. Today, her natural hair was pulled back into a sophisticated bun, the shining texture hinting at a heritage rich in resilience and pride. She wore a simple yet impossibly expensive orange gown, the designer's hand discernible only to the elite circles in which she floated. On her wrist, a custom bracelet glimmered, the quiet sort of gift exchanged between leaders behind closed doors. Caroline's journey had already spanned continents. Boarding schools in Switzerland, family estates in Dubai, tech summits in New York. Yet none of this was visible to the casual glance. She held in one hand a first-class boarding pass, a ticket not just to luxury, but to a narrative of hard-won triumphs won by her father, David Williams. His story had clawed its way up from the background noise of the world, a tale of innovation, battles against prejudice, and the relentless forging of a $12 billion enterprise. David Williams was a name synonymous with success, a black tech visionary whose business empire now stretched across hotel chains, airlines, and sprawling offices on 6 continents. Despite the glow of generational achievement, Caroline was still, to most eyes, simply a young black girl. And it was precisely this blindness that allowed the crisis to ignite as she approached row 2, ready to claim seat 2A, the space her family's labor and legacy had earned her. Waiting in that seat was a white businessman, mid-50s, his graying hair disheveled, and his suit rumpled as though the world itself owed him comfort. Caroline paused, her path interrupted by entitlement clothed in corporate status. She spoke with a politeness trained over years. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," extending her pristine boarding pass. She did not raise her voice, did not flinch, her accent sharp with international refinement, her manner cool but unyielding. The businessman, engrossed in the blue glow of his phone, barely registered the interruption. He flicked his wrist dismissively. "No, little girl, you must be confused. This is my seat." His words, dismissive and laden with condescension, slithered into the quiet air of first class, contaminating it with something far more toxic than simple inconvenience. Passengers turned, a ripple of discomfort surging through the space. and Caroline's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her grace becoming a shield. In that moment, as the businessman refused not only Caroline's ticket, but her presence, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just private prejudice, but the insidious structures of bias nested within comfort, privilege, and power. What followed was not merely a skirmish over assigned seating. It would, in the hours to come, ground a plane before its wheels ever left the runway, and transform one little girl's stand into a lesson for all who watched. The hush of anticipation fractured into an uneasy electricity. As Caroline kept her composure, the businessman's refusal began to draw attention, not just idle curiosity, but the sort of focus born from the knowledge that something important, perhaps uncomfortable, was unfolding. The flight attendant hadn't yet appeared, but the cabin's energy shifted. People sensed the tension before they truly understood the cause. And I apologize to the author for interrupting this story. I would be very pleased if my listener would subscribe, and leave their thoughts on this story in the comments. I won't delay you any longer. Enjoy. Nearby passengers exchanged glances. A young woman across the aisle furrowed her brow, while a businessman a row behind discreetly angled his camera, recognizing the significance of what he was witnessing. In this rarefied atmosphere, where money and prestige were supposed to trump all else, Caroline's struggle stood in stark contrast to the expectations of some and the fears of others. Caroline returned the stare, unwavering. She remembered her father's lessons. Never let emotions dictate your response in moments of injustice. Calm was strength. Power, rooted not in volume, but certainty. She repeated, her voice laced with politeness and resolve. Sir, I'm not confused. This is seat 2A, as confirmed on my boarding pass. You're sitting in my assigned seat. She extended the pass closer, her fingers steady, her gaze clear. The businessman, now forced to interact, looked up with irritation thick on his face, as though the challenge itself was an affront to his carefully curated hierarchy. His eyes moved over Caroline, cataloging and dismissing her based on age, gender, color. Without checking the boarding pass, he chuckled condescendingly. Listen, sweetheart, children don't just wander into first class. Your parents must be looking for you in economy. Why don't you go join them before someone gets concerned? It was a performance of prejudice, a string of assumptions spoken with casual cruelty. He presumed she was not only out of place, but dependent, incapable, a trespasser in the world of privilege he inhabited. Each word layered insult upon insult, reducing Caroline's entire lived reality to a fantasy of inferiority in his mind. The air thickened. More passengers listened in, their discomfort palpable. Some looked away, hoping the conflict would fade. Others fixed their attention in expectation of escalation. Caroline felt the familiar sting, not merely personal, but ancestral, a reminder of generations discounted and diminished by similar words. Nevertheless, she stood her ground, knowing her worth was rooted deeper than passing judgments. Sir, Caroline replied with a serenity that belied the insult's weight. I assure you, my parents aren't an economy, and I am not confused about where I belong. If you would take a moment to read my pass, you'll see that I'm right." He laughed, brushing her off yet again. "Kids today," he sneered, the laugh now edged with something less friendly. "Always trying to play pretend." A few others, emboldened or disturbed, murmured support or quiet condemnation. The simmering conflict was suddenly more than a private matter. It was becoming a test of values, and people were taking sides. Caroline's mind raced through her father's wisdom. Her father, David Williams, had shaped her understanding of power not through domination, but through certainty, through knowing that justice is measured not by loud words, but by right actions. The businessman Robert Henderson had no idea of the strength arrayed against him. If he had looked beyond surface judgments, he might have glimpsed the world-shifting consequences about to unfold. As the tension in the cabin rippled, the flight attendant arrived, drawn by the growing number of eyes and the audible escalation. The expectation was that she would resolve the matter, restore order, and enforce fairness without bias. But the weight of her own preconceptions, accumulated over 20 years of service and shaped by untold encounters, bent her judgment. She turned first to Caroline, her face devoid of warmth, her tone that of a teacher correcting a child rather than a professional mediating between equals. "Ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" Her words were not unreasonable in themselves, but their placement and inflection revealed a deep-seated assumption. The child was likely confused, mistaken, out of her depth. Caroline offered her pass with steady hands, aware of the scrutiny but not cowed by it. The attendant examined it with exaggerated care, looking not for confirmation, but for an opportunity to question its legitimacy. Meanwhile, Henderson sat rigid, refusing to present his own boarding pass. His entitlement unchallenged, his voice dripping with annoyance at the interruption of his routine. "This does show seat 2A, the attendant admitted reluctantly, the words slow and hesitant. "But there seems to be some confusion." She turned to Henderson, her deference unmistakable, her tone now softer, almost apologetic. "Sir, could I possibly see your pass as well?" Henderson would not comply. "I don't need to show anything," he said flatly. "I've been flying first class for years." This little girl is clearly lost. In that moment, it was not just Caroline's seat being denied, but her right to exist in a space purchased and promised by family achievement. The attendant's answer, weak and conciliatory, was a betrayal, not just of airline policy, but of justice. "Well, perhaps we could find Miss Williams another seat in first class. I'm sure we can work something out." It was a suggestion that favored the aggressor over the rightful owner of seat 2A, weighing institutional comfort higher than moral clarity. Caroline's dignity was being asked indirectly to make way for Henderson's arrogance. Before Caroline could answer, Henderson escalated, his words now openly hostile and saturated with racial implication. "You should go find your economy seat, maybe near the bathrooms where you belong." His attempt to belittle her, and by extension all black passengers, revealed a depth of malice that shocked even those who had hoped to remain neutral. Recordings continued, some passengers already whispering about potential lawsuits and viral outrage. A hostility of the cabin pressed in. Some chuckled nervously. Others gaped in silent horror. Caroline, fire in her veins, drew upon her family's legacy, the power to choose controlled, effective action. Her answer was cold and measured, slicing through the room's heat. I paid for this seat with my own money. I belong here more than you, since you can't prove you even belong on this plane. Her words, precise and devastating, forced some of the passengers to rethink their own silent assumptions. Caroline was not a victim. She was a challenger, and her calm set the stage for consequences that Henderson had never expected to face. The cabin was now fully divided. Some passengers burned with outrage. Others stewed in discomfort. A few, emboldened by the spectacle, sided with Henderson, upholding the unspoken hierarchy they believed first class ought to protect. But Caroline, standing alone yet undiminished, had changed the dynamic. She had forced the issue out of the shadows and into public reckoning. Henderson, unable to retreat, struck again. His voice, loud and scornful, challenged not only Caroline's claim, but her very legitimacy. You don't even look like you could afford a ticket here. Did you steal someone's pass? Or maybe Daddy's flying you on charity. The racist implications were now unmistakable. The contempt for black achievement laid bare. The recording businessman zoomed in, capturing each line, a digital archive of prejudice. The air was thick with judgment and unspoken questions. And sides were being chosen, not just out of sympathy, but out of long-held beliefs about who deserved comfort and who merely intruded upon it. A flight attendant, caught between policy and her own biases, made the dire mistake of turning on Caroline. Her warning was a profound injustice, a demand for silence from the victim, and an implicit endorsement of the aggressor. Miss Williams, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and find a solution that works for everyone, or I'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft for causing a disturbance. Gasps scattered through the cabin. It was a reversal of responsibility, an indictment of courage, an attempt to smooth over conflict by coercing the innocent. Caroline was not just being denied her seat. She was being threatened for asserting her rights. The woman across the aisle surged to her feet. Are you serious? She's the one causing the disturbance? Yet the attendant stood firm, her alignment now almost completely with Henderson, the institutional bias exposed for all to see. Caroline watched, heart pounding, as her options narrowed. But training had prepared her for precisely this moment, when the world demanded submission from those it considered outsiders, and justice required a clear, unwavering refusal. She spoke with dangerous calm, each word a warning. Ma'am, I think you should be very careful about how you handle this situation. Her voice promised consequences far beyond the ordinary, and for the first time, the flight attendant's poise began to falter. If they had known who Caroline Williams truly was, understood the depth of the resources arrayed beneath her quiet composure, they might have retreated. But the lesson that followed was one carved out by willpower, by the certainty of belonging, even when denied by those who could neither see nor accept it. The pressure in the cabin reached a fever pitch. Henderson, sensing the flight attendant's backing and drawing on his own confidence, escalated further. He stood with calculated intimidation, looming over Caroline, his words finally clear enough that none could ignore their venom. Your problem is that you people think you can take whatever you want. You think you deserve things you didn't earn. Well, this is the real world, little girl. There are consequences for not knowing your place. His language, you people, your place, was naked in its prejudice. Any pretense of civility evaporated. Phones came out, flashes of outrage and documentation, the evidence rapidly spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft. A middle-aged black woman in row 4 challenged him, her voice trembling with fury. Did you just tell a child to know her place because of her race? Yet even as Henderson tried to brush her aside, the implication was clear. For him, circumstance dictated belonging, not achievement, not proof, not right. It was segregation, shaded with the thin guise of order. Caroline, steel hidden within velvet calm, prepared for her final move. She had faced this before. Her father's empire had been built in the face of such obstacles, and had been taught the importance of strategic response. Sir, she cut through the chaos, I think you should sit down and be quiet now. The challenge, made with unwavering certainty, finally shook Henderson. He mocked her. Call your mommy. Tell the principal. Adults handle things differently than children. Caroline smiled, a razor's edge of composure. You're absolutely right. Adults do handle things differently. And you're about to learn how differently. She reached into her designer purse, extracting a phone so unique, only a handful in the world possessed its modifications. It was more than a symbol. It was a connection to a global network of influence and protection. She dialed, her movements deliberate, her face serene. The cabin buzzed with anticipation. Would her call merely summon a helpless parent, or something far greater? When her father's voice answered, clear, commanding, unmistakable, the atmosphere in first class shifted. No longer merely a struggle between passengers. It was now a test of what happens when prejudice meets the full weight of consequence and power. Caroline explained the situation, her voice cutting through every doubt. Her father's low tone a promise that justice, and not convenience, would guide what happened next. David Williams was a force, a man whose reputation preceded his entrance into any room, conference, or negotiation. When he picked up the call from his daughter, his mind instantly activated with the protective, calculating energy of a father and a business leader. It was early afternoon in his Century City office, but the tone in Caroline's first words compelled him to silence his staff with a wave and turn his attention fully to her dilemma. Daddy, there's a problem on the plane, Caroline began, her voice filled with the calm urgency she inherited from him. A gentleman is refusing to move from my assigned seat, and the flight attendant wants me to be quiet and move, even though I have the ticket. She gave him just the facts, a detailed summary, not a plea. David had weathered storms much fiercer than this. The battles he'd fought to expand his company, to join exclusive golf clubs, to have his children admitted to elite schools, all had tested the boundaries of society's prejudices. His pride momentarily flickered as he realized how well Caroline had asserted herself. But now was not the time for pride. He pressed a button on his phone's screen, patching in his head of legal affairs, Mirabelle, a woman whose expertise had saved the company and the family countless times. "Caroline, stay on the line. I'm about to speak to the crew. Keep your phone on speaker." His baritone was rich with authority, each word chiseled, each syllable a bullet point in a contract. Within moments, Mirabelle notified the airline's executive office, a direct line David's company maintained as a partner in key business ventures. The dominoes began to fall. The corporate flight team, the chief pilot, and even the airline's CEO were immediately told, "There's a potential crisis in first class, and it involves Caroline Williams. Handle it correctly, or face very public consequences." Back in the plane, Caroline held out her phone. "Would you like to speak to my father? He's very eager to resolve things, and he's an important partner to your airline," she said, her phrasing careful but pointed. The flight attendant, suddenly thrown by the shift of power, hesitated. Behind her, a member of the crew whispered, "Caroline Williams, like David Williams' daughter?" The dynamics snapped into new configuration. What was a contest of assumptions transformed into a test of institutional readiness. For Henderson, realization began to dawn. His earlier certainty flickered with doubt. Spectators, sensing an unusual gravity, watched in silence as the story's axis skewed. David's words, piped through speakerphone, landed with surgical precision. "This is David Williams. I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately." The authority in his voice was not to be ignored. The flight attendant, understanding she now stood at the edge of a disastrous misstep, radioed for the ground supervisor. Protocol when an executive complaint of this magnitude was involved. Beyond the pressurized cabin walls, airport operations began to bristle with activity. Managers hurried to the jetway, legal teams were readied, and the first corporate policy emails of the day began to fly. The world beyond Caroline's immediate circle was now fully alerted, prepared to make amends, publicly and thoroughly, to the abused party and her family. The wheels of responsibility squealed into motion as the ground supervisor, Christine Soto, strode briskly from the terminal office to the aircraft parked at the gate. Christine was renowned for her crisis management skills, but also wore, hidden beneath her pragmatic exterior, the scars of many years dealing with entitled guests and systemic blind spots. She mentally reviewed protocols. If bias was proven, the situation could balloon into a legal and PR disaster. There was no margin for error. Back inside, passengers fell silent. The tension knotted so tightly in the air that it was almost difficult to breathe. Henderson, sensing the ground shifting under his feet, looked around for allies, but the eyes that met his no longer held the easy camaraderie of privilege. They were calculating, wary, and a little guilty. The flight attendant, now realizing her own future was at stake, opened the aisle to allow Christine to enter. Christine's arrival changed everything. She introduced herself with practiced warmth, listened to Caroline's clear and calm summary, and immediately requested to see both boarding passes. Henderson, growling, grudgingly produced his own. He was, in fact, ticketed for seat 2C, not 2A. Christine's eyes flickered briefly as she compared them. There was no ambiguity. The seat belonged to Caroline. "Thank you for your patience, Miss Williams," Christine said, her voice respectful, with a subtle note of apology. "Mr. Henderson, you are in seat 2C. Please gather your things and move." It was an instruction, not a request. Even Henderson's habitual arrogance could not withstand the certainty of authority wielded without bias. The entire first-class cabin watched as Henderson stood, red-faced and muttering. The moment was recorded, immortalized in multiple camera angles, each a testament to how power can and should be wielded correctly. With a few measured words, Christine restored the balance of justice, though the memory of its earlier inversion remained in the air. But Christine did more. She ushered the flight attendant to join them at the front, away from the other passengers. In quiet but clear tones, she reminded her of the importance of unbiased professionalism. "You're responsible for enforcing airline policy, not for deciding who deserves to be here. Today, that line was crossed." There will be a report. For Caroline, vindication came not merely from being allowed to sit, but from seeing consequences approach for those who denied her. She slipped into seat 2A, shoulders straight, eyes forward, a queen reclaiming her throne not by force, but by the quiet, relentless insistence on justice. Passengers murmured their support as Henderson slumped in his new seat. Several, inspired or seeking absolution, offered whispered apologies or congratulations to Caroline. The energy shifted from tension to a strange, hesitant celebration, the kind that follows right after a thunderstorm, when the sky is brighter, but the ground is still damp. With the situation contained, Christine instructed the captain and crew to delay departure while statements were taken. This step, while protocol for disrupted boarding, also served a dual purpose. It allowed the airline's executive team to assess the growing number of passenger recordings, already trickling out to social media, tagged with hashtag Caroline Williams and hashtag First Class Justice. David remained on the line with Caroline, reassuring and encouraging her. "You did exactly right, honey. Don't let anyone diminish you, no matter how loudly they shout or how quietly they whisper." Caroline nodded, trying to internalize pride instead of relief. She felt the weight of her family's expectations, her father's lessons, her mother's gentle strength, her ancestors' dreams for a day like this, when a young black girl's rightful place would be defended and recognized. Meanwhile, the pressurizing power of the outside world began pressing in. The story, now retweeted by influencers and journalists, careened through cyberspace. Black child denied seat in first class by entitled businessman. Airline responds. The comments ranged from outrage to celebration, and the first round of headlines included official statements from the airline, hastily composed by their crisis PR unit. "We deeply regret this incident and will review our staff's performance and policies to ensure all customers are treated with dignity and respect." Henderson, realizing with mounting horror the scope of the spectacle, tried to recline and ignore the flickering screens around him. But the damage was already done. Passengers exchanged details with Caroline, vowing to champion her version of events. The woman across the aisle even started a live stream, framing her commentary as a lesson for would-be social justice warriors and defenders of the status quo alike. Amid the chaos, Caroline found herself comforting others, reassuring strangers that she was fine, offering words of forgiveness even to some who had not spoken up soon enough. Her poise deepened. Her sense of justice matured in the crucible of public scrutiny. The cabin, once fractured and hostile, became a strange fellowship, united briefly by a collective hope that something good might yet emerge from pain and humiliation. Finally, nearly an hour late, the plane lifted off from the runway, its engines humming like a promise. As the landscape of California shrank beneath them, those in first class were left to stew in the aftermath of confrontation. The hum of polite conversation had replaced earlier tension, but there remained a palpable undertone, a processing, a regret, a desire to understand how each might have acted differently. Caroline leaned back in her seat, peering out the window at the receding sprawl of the city. She replayed each moment in her mind, not out of bitterness, but to catalog the lessons learned. She remembered how her father had taught her to transform adversity into growth, that the value of every injustice was how one responded, how one claimed one's space without apology or shame. Meanwhile, Henderson sat 2 spaces away, fuming, his earlier arrogance replaced by a hollow, uncertain anger. He had been exposed before an audience that included corporate representatives, social media, and strangers whose opinions would ripple far beyond this day and this flight. He could not see that Caroline had won not just a seat, but a kind of vindication that would inspire others long after this flight landed. As the cabin settled, the flight attendant offered Caroline a quiet, private apology. "I'm sorry, Miss Williams. I was wrong." The words, while long overdue, still mattered. A token of recognition that mistakes had been made, that real change required acknowledging discomfort and error. Caroline accepted the apology with grace, asking only that the attendant do better for the next black or brown child, or anyone who didn't fit a silent, unspoken template of who belonged. Her request was simple. Just remember today. Next time, do what's right from the start. The attendant nodded, chastened, her own understanding now sharpened by the ordeal. In the peaceful hum of cruising altitude, Caroline closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the plane and the distant murmur of new conversations. She understood now a little more of what her father meant when he spoke about carrying a legacy, not as a burden, but as a torch, a promise to oneself and to the world. On the ground, the firestorm continued. News outlets picked up footage from passengers, spinning the incident into a national conversation about race, privilege, and the rights of children in adult spaces. Bloggers unpacked the nuances. Why was a black child's word disbelieved? How might the affluent mask their own prejudices behind policy and procedure? The airline's hotline blinked with calls from both furious critics and admiring supporters. David and his legal team coordinated with the family's publicist, who balanced the demands of interviews and privacy. Caroline's story was not a solitary victory, but a lens through which millions witnessed, reflected, and pondered their own role in an ongoing struggle for justice and visibility. Offers to speak, donate, and campaign flooded in. For Caroline, it was disorienting but exhilarating, proof that even one person's story could bend the arc of justice, however slightly, toward hope. In the weeks that followed, the airline announced sweeping new protocols and bias training designed not just to appease, but to prevent future injustices. The Flight Attendants Union asked for dialogue and reform, while passengers from Flight 892 testified on talk shows, in blogs, and in private that they had witnessed something they could never unsee. For Henderson, the ordeal was devastating. His attempt to silence and shame had instead drawn the gaze of 1,000 eyes, each holding him accountable in ways he'd never imagined. He was not fired yet, but his company's executive board took the incident seriously, requiring him to undergo diversity education and public apology. Caroline, meanwhile, gained new confidence. She grew into the story, wielding her voice like a jewel, bright, patient, and powerful. She did not seek revenge nor bask in fame. She set her sights on a larger horizon, aware that her journey was only beginning, and that countless others waited for the same chance to be seen, heard, and taken seriously. For the Williams family, the fallout from that single flight dramatically reconfigured their daily lives. The media attention was unrelenting, an endless cycle of interview requests, talk show invitations, and panel offers on late-night programs. David Williams was seasoned in keeping a low profile when it came to personal matters, but now he had to strike a delicate balance between protecting his daughter's innocence and letting her story foster change. The family's estate in Pacific Palisades, usually a haven of tranquility and privacy, was suddenly besieged by journalists and news vans. Reporters camped outside the gated entrance, waiting for glimpses of Caroline. Major magazines vied for exclusive features, some hoping to capture the essence of Black resilience, others hunting for controversy and hot takes on the intersection of race, wealth, and entitlement. David's wife, Michelle, an accomplished attorney herself, insisted on maintaining normalcy inside the home. She woke Caroline every morning with a gentle touch, encouraging her to pursue the schoolwork, cello lessons, and art projects that made her happy long before the world decided she was a symbol. Still, Caroline couldn't ignore the surge of new followers on her social media. The handwritten letters now arriving daily from girls and boys across the country. "Daddy, some of these people want me to be their hero," Caroline admitted, curling beside him on the sunlit porch. "But I didn't try to be brave. I just wanted to sit in the seat we paid for." David smiled, his eyes creased with pride and pain. "That's exactly why you are brave. Most people stay quiet or walk away. You stood your ground, not just for you, but for all the kids who came before you, and for those who'll board a plane after you." The family leaned into the chaos with a mix of pride and caution. Michelle sifted through hundreds of invitations, consulting with counselors and advocates to shield her daughter from the worst of online vitriol and the misleading narratives that sometimes crept into coverage. David, meanwhile, liaised with schools, business partners, and community leaders, determined that the incident would spark lasting change well beyond a news cycle's flush of attention. One Saturday, the Williams family gathered around their kitchen table to read aloud some of the hundreds of letters and emails that poured in. Some were from children who felt seen for the first time. Others from teachers committing to self-examination. And a scattering from passengers who'd been on the Denver flight, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The support offered comfort, but the gravity was sobering. "You have a voice now, darling," Michelle counseled, as Caroline wiped away tears from a particularly moving letter. "The world's listening. What you say, how you carry yourself, could help other children know they matter just as much as anyone else in first class." For Caroline, the realization came gradually. Her ordeal had remade her world, placing her at the center of conversations she'd only ever overheard. She knew she couldn't retreat into anonymity, nor did she want to, because she'd discovered a quiet conviction inside herself, a flame her parents had fanned and life had kindled. Lessons bloom, now burning for all to see. Within the walls of the airline's corporate headquarters, the incident with Caroline became a case study overnight, one that forced rapid change and harsh self-examination. PR consultants, crisis managers, and executives locked themselves in conference rooms, reviewing footage, combing through incident reports, and analyzing the rapidly multiplying threads on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The CEO's weekly address to staff took on an unthinkable urgency. "Let this be clear. Every passenger deserves unbiased, respectful treatment. What happened to Miss Williams is unacceptable, and it's our job to make sure it never happens again. We are reviewing protocols, retraining staff, and sending a clear message. Discrimination, covert or explicit, will not be tolerated." Internal memos outlined the beginning of a new era. Implicit bias seminars, anti-racism workshops, and mandatory cultural competence classes were rolled out. Some employees balked, others embraced the change. Town halls were held, encouraging dialogue about uncomfortable but necessary truths. Why did it take a high-profile victim for these conversations to take root? How many incidents had gone unreported? Were apologies and check-the-box reforms enough? Flight attendants, including the woman from Caroline's flight, were called in for personal reflection sessions. She sat, hands trembling, and spoke about the impact her actions had, not just on Caroline, but on the trust and dignity of countless passengers before her. She offered a tearful apology during a streamed union meeting. "I let a young girl down. I let my profession down. That will not happen again." Senior staff, worried about the long-term reputation risk and business implications, convened with community advocates and diversity consultants. They invited Caroline's family to weigh in on what systemic reform should look like. And for the first time, the lived reality of a front-facing PR moment threatened to inspire meaningful, lasting culture change. Behind the headlines, some staff resisted. Quiet emails and private messages circulated among a minority who clung to the idea that everyone had overreacted, or who resented being told how to feel about race and equity. The CEO, counseled by David Williams himself, refused to back down. To admit mistakes is not to court weakness. It's to show we are willing to be held to the highest standard, he declared at a shareholders' meeting. Real leadership is measured by the courage to grow. Through every corridor, from break rooms to boardrooms, people whispered Caroline's name, not as a passing scandal, but as a symbol of how a single act of courage could open floodgates of honesty and change in even the most insulated institutions. A week after her ordeal, Caroline returned to school, dreading both the spotlight and private whispers of her classmates. Her best friend, Yasmin, greeted her in the courtyard with an exuberant hug, while teachers offered sympathetic smiles. The principal, Mrs. Romero, addressed the assembly with pride. "We are honored to have a student who showed such dignity and bravery. Let Caroline's example remind us, justice begins with each of us every day." But not every response was comfortable. Some students, raised on stories of meritocracy and color blindness, viewed Caroline now not just as a peer, but as a headline. A few avoided eye contact. A handful snickered, parroting lines they'd overheard from parents. "Must be nice to have rich parents bail you out." Or, "She'll get into any school now just because of that flight thing." Caroline felt the sting of new doubts, a mix of isolation and pressure to live up to an impossible image. Determined not to shrink, Caroline threw herself into her schoolwork and after-school clubs. During debate team practice, she harnessed her experience, crafting arguments about justice, equality, and due process that left classmates in awe. In her journal, she documented each encounter, not as a record of wounds, but as a blueprint for resilience. She joined the school's Diversity and Belonging Committee, where she gently corrected misconceptions and urged other students to speak up if they saw something unjust. She mentored younger children, especially those who felt different or left out, sharing stories not of trauma, but of triumph. A narrative strategy her parents applauded. At a student assembly, when the school invited her to address her peers, Caroline's hands shook as she gripped the off-white note card. She spoke candidly. "Sometimes adults are wrong, but being right isn't enough. You have to speak up. And if you're alone at first, remember, you have friends you haven't even met yet, who'll stand with you when it matters." Her speech was met with a standing ovation. For the first time since that flight, she felt something more enduring than vindication. She felt hope. And as she returned to her seat, Yasmin squeezed her hand and whispered, "Your leader, Care." That means people might resist you, but they'll always remember you. The incident reverberated far beyond Caroline's immediate circles. Across the country, parent groups referenced her case, while advocating for anti-bias curriculum in schools. Airlines reviewed and revised customer interaction policies. In university classrooms, her experience became a case study in ethics and leadership. A major television network developed a primetime documentary titled "Where We Belong," focusing on Caroline's story and dozens like it. Widely praised for its nuance, the documentary featured interviews with passengers, airline crew, activists, and scholars. Caroline's segment closed the program, her voice, poised and honest, urging viewers to create the kind of room where nobody ever has to prove they belong. The family received invitations from prestigious organizations. Caroline was awarded a National Youth Advocacy honor, and David and Michelle were asked to keynote at diversity summits. The three of them traveled together, sharing insights not just about the confrontation, but about the responsibility that comes with privilege. Social media swelled with campaigns. #Belonging is for everyone trended for weeks as people posted their own stories of exclusion and inclusion. the Williams family established a foundation using the unexpected influx of donations and attention to support scholarships for children of color pursuing STEM and business careers. Caroline worked alongside her parents, reviewing grant applications and penning handwritten notes to each recipient. You belong. Don't let anyone tell you different. And yet, not every echo was celebratory. Critics lambasted the coverage as performative, resenting the attention focused on what they dismissed as a rich family's problem. Some trolls tried to distort the story, weaponizing race and class anxieties in comment sections and forums. The Williams family, seasoned by adversity, addressed detractors head-on. Respond, don't retreat, David insisted. Yet through it all, Caroline's poise only deepened. She understood now that every stand for justice was met by those who would push back, but that each step taken forward, even if small, made it easier for others to walk the same path. With months passing, the Williams family slowly reclaimed their privacy, though the lessons of that fateful day never faded. Dinner conversations revolved less around media requests and more around the bigger questions. What kind of world did they want to help build? How could they leverage their experience differently? David's business empire continued to flourish, yet he became more conscious of the environments he helped shape. He established a leadership pipeline for rising executives of color, championed ethical practices in all partnerships, and made bias training non-negotiable for every company he touched. Michelle, inspired by the letters children sent Caroline, launched a legal aid initiative aimed at protecting marginalized families in public settings. She led workshops for parents and educators, encouraging them to recognize unconscious bias not as an accusation, but as a call to awareness and growth. Caroline balanced her new activism with the joys of being a child, painting landscapes on her bedroom wall, riding her bike with Yasmin through leafy suburban streets, and occasionally binge-watching old sitcoms after homework. Yet the events on Flight 892 had fundamentally changed her. She was braver now, less likely to cower in the face of institutional indifference. On the anniversary of the flight, the family boarded a plane, not in first class, but together, seated in economy among a diverse patchwork of families, couples, and solo travelers. David winked at her as they buckled in, signaling this was a fresh chapter, the past acknowledged, but the future wide open and unwritten. As the plane lifted into a sunrise streaked with pink and gold, Caroline pressed her forehead to the window. She felt no resentment, only possibility. In that moment, she whispered a silent promise to own every room, every space with dignity, to make the world a little bigger and kinder for everyone who still waited for their belonging to be recognized. The months following Caroline's ordeal saw a quiet but persistent ripple through her local community. What began as an incident on a plane became a catalyst for difficult conversations among neighbors, civic leaders, and parents. Inspired by Caroline's poised leadership, the Williams family hosted a town hall at the neighborhood recreation center. People gathered, black, white, brown, new immigrants, single parents, even airline staff, risking discomfort to speak frankly about bias, belonging, and shared responsibility. At first, the event crackled with tension. Some bristled at the suggestion that they, too, harbored hidden prejudices. Others chafed at stories of exclusion that mirrored their own. But as David and Michelle gently facilitated, the room's energy softened. Caroline addressed the group herself, voice trembling. Then, steady. Sometimes the people who hurt you are just repeating what they've learned. We all need new lessons, so every child feels at home, no matter where they sit. From that evening forward, new connections bloomed. The local school district piloted an equity curriculum with family workshops. The airlines sent liaisons to participate, recognizing that institutional change relies on community trust. Caroline was asked to join the Youth Action Committee, lending her perspective to help evaluate and shape policies. She discovered she was not alone. Dozens of kids recounted times when they'd been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong where their hopes had taken them. The Williams family lent their support to these efforts, sometimes speaking up publicly, sometimes funding quietly from behind the scenes. They knew that the structure of belonging was fragile, built not just from courageous moments, but from the persistence of small, everyday actions, of holding doors open, back-checking prejudices, and lifting up voices that aren't easily heard. For Caroline, seeing change unfold at home was bittersweet. She confronted sadness at stories shared by peers she thought had been untouched by exclusion. She felt hope pulse through her, though every time she witnessed a parent apologizing for subconscious bias, or heard a child shout back at an unfair rule in the lunchroom, she understood she could not fix the world alone. But as she watched her neighborhood change, she recognized the power of ripples, how they grow outward, shaping the lives and hearts of strangers. As Caroline's reputation grew, she began receiving invitations to speak at national youth summits, student leadership retreats, and diversity conferences. Each event was intimidating in its own way. Standing before hundreds of teenagers or a panel of seasoned educators made her hands sweat, her voice shake. Sometimes, Caroline would look over at her father, who always sat front row, eyes shining with support, and she'd remember his mantra: "You don't have to be fearless. You just have to act." At one conference, packed with middle schoolers from across California, Caroline recounted her flight experience, not as a tale of victimhood or anger, but as a call to bravery. "I used to worry that I wasn't enough," she told the captivated audience, "but I realized that belonging isn't a reward. It's a right. And rights aren't given. They're claimed." After her talk, children and parents crowded around, sharing stories and asking advice. Caroline listened as a shy boy admitted he was often passed over for sports teams because of his accent, and as a girl tried to explain how hard it felt to stand up for herself as both new and different. Each story deepened Caroline's empathy. She resolved to amplify not just her own voice, but theirs too. David and Michelle gently nudged their daughter to balance activism with childhood joys. They took vacations together, insulated her from media when needed, and reminded Caroline that real change sometimes arrives slowly. But Caroline thrived in her new role, learning that advocacy wasn't about always knowing the right answer. It was about asking questions, showing up, and inviting others to do the same. Inspired, Caroline began a blog called Claim Your Seat. She interviewed local activists, shared resources, and wrote essays affirming that every child deserved dignity and respect, no matter the setting. Her site became a vital link for students, teachers, and parents nationwide. She invited guest writers, moderated virtual panels, and made space for stories that challenged, comforted, and educated. In these moments of shared vulnerability and hope, Caroline found a sense of fulfillment that money or fame could never offer. She became a bridge builder, linking communities and individuals. And as more and more young people joined her movement, it was clear that her story on Flight 892 had grown into a campaign for justice, compassion, and belonging across the country. No movement toward justice is met solely with applause, and soon, Caroline and her family faced new challenges. Some parents objected to her activism, claiming it politicized what should be a simple bus ride or classroom lesson. Comment sections occasionally turned ugly, filled with microaggressions and outright attacks aimed not just at Caroline, but at the idea that children's voices could upend adult order. Once, at a public event, a panel moderator asked Caroline whether she thought too much attention was being paid to incidents like hers, implying they distracted from real problems. Caroline paused, gathering her thoughts, refusing to be rushed or intimidated. It isn't just about seats or cabins. It's about whether we treat each other with respect, especially when it's inconvenient. Some diversity initiatives inspired by her story encountered bureaucratic resistance, stalled by insufficient funding or lukewarm buy-in from administrators. A few friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the spotlight or insistent that Caroline must be making too big a deal of things. Through it all, Caroline leaned on her family's resilience and wisdom, knowing that progress required stamina and hope, not just conviction. Faced with criticism, David and Michelle redoubled their support. They reminded Caroline that leadership often invites misunderstanding and envy, but insisted she focus on constructive dialogue and the needs of the most vulnerable. At family dinners, the Williamses dissected negative coverage, analyzed policy trends, and brainstormed new ways to make impact. Caroline strengthened her advocacy. She spoke in classrooms, designed workshops for teachers, and continued to mentor younger students, navigating the same obstacles she had faced. She insisted on joy, organizing dances, art shows, and science fairs for kids who were so often told they didn't belong in creative or technical spaces. The resistance, rather than silencing her, refined Caroline's message. It forced her to clarify goals, to expand the definition of belonging, and to invite even her critics into conversation. She realized, deeply, that true transformation required engagement with everyone, even those reluctant to change. Beyond the noise and attention, the greatest changes unfolded inside Caroline herself. She had always been introspective, prone to journaling about her dreams and fears. Now, she used writing to process the complexity of her journey, recording not just victories, but also moments of hurt, confusion, and fatigue. Therapy became an invaluable resource, helping Caroline manage anxiety around public appearances and the pressure to always represent something larger than herself. Her counselor, Mrs. Patel, guided her gently to balance obligation and joy. lessons bloom, reminding her that healing was not weakness, but necessity. Meanwhile, family rituals took on added importance as anchors to normalcy. They hiked together in the mountains, hosted movie nights, and celebrated small milestones with exuberance. Michelle emphasized the importance of self-care, encouraging Caroline to take breaks, set boundaries, and remember that she could say no. As the anniversary of the flight approached, Caroline struggled and persevered. She wrote pages in her journal about fear, the fear of being alone, of being misunderstood, of never seeing real change. But in each entry, hope reasserted itself. She pledged to find balance, to share her story while reserving space, to just be a child. David supported her growth with quiet wisdom. You're allowed to rest. You don't have to carry the world every day. Justice needs warriors, but it also needs visionaries and healers. With time, Caroline came to recognize her own needs, drawing boundaries between advocacy and self-care. In these moments of introspection, she realized she had grown strong, not just from standing her ground, but from holding space for herself and others to be vulnerable. Our journey was about more than seats and summaries. It was about becoming whole, hopeful, and ready for whatever life and injustice might bring next. Years later, the story of Caroline Williams and Flight 892 remained a touchstone for conversations about equity and inclusion. Her name was invoked in scholarships, mentoring programs, and airline policy documents. The Williams Family's Foundation helped thousands of children claim their places in classrooms, boardrooms, and creative fields they'd once been told were closed to them. Caroline continued to grow. She graduated high school with honors, co-authored books about youth leadership, and led international workshops on building cultures of belonging. Her blog evolved into a global digital community, linking youth activists across continents and causes. Yet for all her success, she never lost the grounding of that original moment, the quiet certainty that dignity must be defended even when it's denied, and that each new generation should inherit a world more open, fair, and welcoming than the last. Her parents, proud and sometimes awed by Caroline's relentless hope, saw their daughter not just as a symbol, but as a living example of courage and compassion. They continued their work, partnering with schools, corporations, and grassroots organizations, determined to ensure the ripples created on a single flight would never cease to spread. On the 10th anniversary of Flight 892, Caroline was invited back to address a new class of student leaders. She took the stage, surrounded by her family and a room full of allies, old and young. She spoke not of anger and exclusion, but of hope, healing, and the promise of possibility. "There's room for all of us," she concluded. "We belong here together. Never let the world tell you otherwise. Claim your seat and make space for the next person. That is how change happens, and that is how we heal." As the audience rose in thunderous applause, Caroline stepped back, smiling. She knew the work was far from finished, but she also knew that together, there was nowhere they couldn't go.